The story of Esther. Esther's unique in two interesting ways. It's unique, one, that I've told you we're going to be looking at a book that has no mention of God. We're there. The book of Esther has no mention in the book of Esther of God. The only book in the Bible with no mention of God. But here's the other thing that I just learned this year. If you were to go to the Dead Sea Scrolls have an example, sometimes multiple examples of every book in the Jewish scripture. Every book in the Bible is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls except for the book of Esther. The book of Esther was not found at all. Remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, these scrolls kept by these scholars, these maybe revolutionaries, maybe zealots who lived in the Qumran community. And so just questions about why the book of Esther would not have been represented among the Dead Sea Scrolls. We can only guess. There's no reason, but it didn't make it in there. So it's kind of interesting. In some sense, it is an un-Bible story. It's a story that's not about God. It's a story, but in many ways it is a story that's all about God. But there's no mention of God. But it's not a story that we normally read about. For one, there's a woman hero. There are woman heroes in the Jewish Bible. What are some of the woman heroes we read about? Deborah, the famous general and judge. Who else? What? Ruth. We read about Ruth. Judith. Rahab. Tamar. Bathsheba. Mary, that's when we get later on in the New Testament. Yeah, so there are stories, but here's the story of Esther, who is a hero, a female hero. But is she the hero because of her wisdom and her experience? Does she become queen because of her brain? Oh, why does she become queen? Just her beauty? She had other spiritual gifts. This is not the story that we tell in middle school or high school, is it? I would often, not having grown up in church, I'd read the book and I would talk to young girls who had grown up in Sunday school, and they were like, she won a beauty contest. And I was like, you might want to read that again. A little bit more than a beauty contest. Apparently she had legs and she knew how to use them. There is a very, very sexual tone that makes its way through this whole book. She spends the night with the king and is his favorite, and so earns the crown of queen. It's a story from exile. This is a story that takes place during the Jewish exile. This is when the northern and southern kingdoms have been taken, conquered. The temple has been just trashed. The temple has been torn down. The nobility, the kings, the prophets, the wise people, the educated people, anyone who was anyone has been torn out of the land and taken away to Babylon, to Syria. And this is taking place in Persia, which will go on to take over, be the next reigning power after Babylon. But it takes place in Susa. It's off the beaten path. This small community of Jewish people who were living in what is now modern-day Iran, and in a very just kind of like Iran is now, like Iraq used to be, a fairly liberal place in the sense that their liberality was they allowed the Jews to live and let live. They allowed the Jewish people to be a people. This is known from just archaeologists have found that there was an openness to other religions. It didn't go terribly far, but more open than other cultures. But it was within that more liberal place, where it was in that place where there was more freedom and more openness given for this community to be Jewish, where one of the greatest works of evil was to happen, where there would, written into the legislative code, became a systemic injustice that Jews were to be killed, slaughtered, and a legalized genocide that was sought by Haman. So this is the story of that. But there's other things that might make it a non-Qumran story. This is not a story that religious people like. Religious people avoid this story because this is a party story. right? This is a party book. I told you the tradition is, and this is a very strong tradition, Jewish people would often, they would vote for moderation, they would teach on moderation, they would say you should live in moderation all your life, except on Purim, where you are to have such a party and drink so heavily that you cannot tell the difference between Mordecai and Haman. And when the story is read, that you would get so drunk that you would cheer for the evil Haman and boo, because the story is read and it becomes almost a wonderful melodrama reading. If you get a chance to see it, it's wonderful. And the crowd gets to yell and scream, and they get to boo Haman, and they get to cheer on their hero Mordecai. But it's just this massive celebration book. It's this incredible party book that ends with this amazing party. And I think I told you that I was in Israel for a Purim celebration, and I can tell you that absolutely that edict is still followed to this day. There is amazing amounts of just sanctioned drinking and celebrating and partying as they celebrate when the Jewish people were saved from this genocide that was attempted in the book of Ruth, in the book of Esther. So, but this is also a book that reminds us we need festivals. We need celebrations. This is a book for party planners. This is a book for the Alyssas in the world. This is the book for those who have the gift of hospitality and party planning. This is a book for those that are reminded that it's important to have traditions. It's important to have festivals. It's important to have parties. It's important even in the midst of the hardest times. It's important to mark the good times. It's important to remember the Thanksgivings that we have. It's important to just go a little crazy and go a little extravagant and just go over the top. It's important to have these moments of memory. That's what Purim is about. So religious people do not like it. Religious people avoid this book. And so it makes sense to me that the Qumran people would not want to have it. It's also a book that celebrates the spa. Right? This is a chrysalis book. This is a spa book. This is months and months of perfume and being wrapped and steam baths. This is the book about, this is a book to celebrate cosmetic treatments, right? This is about, we know that Esther went through a year of these, it's a spa year. This is a book that's,
we could all look good.
We could all. This is a book about treatments and about just luxury and just kind of funny about this. It's also a book about an enemy. There is an enemy in the book. The enemy is Haman. Boo. But the word is not even. And the word enemy maybe doesn't go far enough. We think of enemy as like a antagonist, but the word itself almost has this meaning of enemy of God. This is something that has everything against what God is going for. This is an anti-God, anti what God is doing. This is a deep, dark enemy, and it's a long story. This is just the punctuation mark in a long story of enemy, because we know that Haman was an Agagite. An Agagite is related to, comes from Amalekite. So if you go back, if you remember the story of Moses, when Moses had to keep his arms up and we put his arms down, the army would start losing, but he would keep his arms up, and then Caleb and Joshua stood by and held his arms up. That whole story, that was against Amalek, the Amalekites. Went on, and then later on in the time of Saul the king had this massive battle in 1 Samuel 15 with the Amalekites. And so this is just that long drawn out battle. This is that long drawn out war of the Israelites and the Amalekites. But it began with just this battle. It went into this incredible kind of long standing battle. But now it is punctuated with a legislative decree, with legalized apartheid, with legalized genocide. It is written into the law code, this freedom, this systemic injustice that Jews can be persecuted, and it's completely and totally legal. So it takes a new turn. It takes a turn, and it no longer is fought on the battlefield, but fought in the courts, fought on the legislative grounds. So it's this very interesting sense. So this is in some sense a book about systemic injustice. It's a book about systemic injustice. We live in a time when we pride ourselves living in a country that we say is about justice. We say we live in a country that strives to focus on justice, and yet even in our country, we have examples of systemic injustice. And I think one of the powerful things about the book of Esther is that she realizes and teaches in this book that when systemic injustice is written into the legal code, it needs to be removed. It needs to be removed from the legal code. So can you think of kind of examples of systemic injustice that might just be a part of our own culture? We can probably see them more clearly in other legal codes, but
I kind of get a sense of that with what's going on right now with the governors saying that the Syrians can't come.
we live in a time where there are some attempts to say we want to mark out this sense, and the irony is, how soon do we forget how many of us are related to immigrants in our country? Not all of us. If any of us here, there's a few of us here with Native American blood. They are not. But we're mostly all immigrants, and we treat immigrants.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
Have we allowed immigrants into this country that want to kill us?
We have allowed immigrants. I mean, we have a long history of immigrants. And this is a political issue that we get to, but there's an attempt. Where do we draw it? So there might be some systemic injustice there as we look at it. I would say go back to our Constitution. What kind of votes did black people get? What kind of votes did slaves get?
Or women. Jim Crow laws.
Well, women didn't get the vote,
Right.
but Jim Crow laws. We look back and when blacks were given, what is it, 2/5? 3/5. We look back and there are places where legalized systemic injustice was written into our code. It was just the way of the land. It was normal. And we've come back later on to go, that wasn't right. And certainly the way we have treated Native Americans throughout, many times in places where we have legalized decrees that have been written in, and we've gone back and said that needs to be written out. That needs to be written out of our code. We're a country that began with freedom of religion, and as always happens, we came to practice free religion. Which free religion did we want to practice? Ours. And we began to set up decrees to make sure that other people didn't practice their free religion, and that had to be written out as we struggled to figure out what does justice look like. And justice is not an easy thing. Justice is a difficult thing. But this is a story of an injustice, a systemic injustice, a group of people being systematically persecuted and genocide. And it needs to be written out of the legal code. There's a great story. A friend of mine was in a courtroom and advocating for the laws advocating for the poor and advocating for those who were being oppressed, and just sat in this courtroom and watched the judge just continue to make decisions for the slumlords over and over and over. The slumlords were being given the rights above the vulnerable renters in the town. And finally, this pastor stood up and said, "Where is the justice? Can I ask a question, Judge? Where is the justice?" And the judge responded very quickly. He said, "This is a court of law. This is not a court of justice. It's a court of law. If you want justice, change the law." But the judge was very clear, and this is true in our culture. The judge is sent to mitigate the law. The judge is sent to work out what the law code says. If you want justice, it's not about changing the justices. It's not about changing the judges. It's changing the law. And Esther is a book about law, and I think that's one reason why it's not loved by religious people, because changing the law is messy. Changing the law code is messy. Writing out systemic injustice that has been perpetrated, writing out systemic injustice that's part of the legal code is a huge, huge challenge. And so that's what makes this messy. This is a book about lawyers. This is a book about politicians. This is a book about the dirty, gross, just awful world of politics and legal, and I think that's why religious people don't like it. And I think that's why the pastors amongst us never preach on it, because we like to talk about things that are clean and happier, like mission work. And this is such an important book. And this is a book that highlights and celebrates those who every day stand in the messiness of trying to work for justice, in the messiness of the politics and the legal codes. Esther and Mordecai stand in the midst of that, trying to affect change in an unjust system. There's something exciting about that. There's also some incredible lines. Did you guys have fun reading this book? Anyone? It's just a fun book. It is a joyful book, as long as you get past it. Anyone struggle with the first chapter? Yeah, I'm sure that's the way it is at your houses. So, Queen Esther is told by Mordecai, we're in trouble. Not only am I in trouble, you're in trouble. Don't think that you're going to get out of this. We are all under this systemic injustice, this genocide that's about to take place. We've got to do something. And in chapter 4, I think he says 3 things that I think are so profound. One, he says, and this is right in line with what Reformed thinking says, do you think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews? For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Here's what Mordecai says. This is what Mordecai believes with his whole heart. And this is what Reformed theology believes. Relief and deliverance will arise from somewhere. Relief and deliverance will arise from somewhere. God will make a way. If you do not step up and make a way, God will make a way. If you don't rise to the occasion, that will not thwart the work of God. We believe that God's kingdom is going to move forward, and whether you decide to do the right thing or not, God's kingdom is not dependent upon you. God's kingdom is not dependent upon your actions. You may decide to do the right thing, you may decide to do the wrong thing. You may decide to follow God, you may decide not to follow God. That will not thwart the movement, the work of the Almighty. What will happen, though, is you will miss the chance to be involved. Mordecai is saying, you've got an opportunity to participate. You may choose to participate, you may choose not to. Don't worry about the Jews, because relief and deliverance will come. God will bring relief and deliverance. God will show up, and he will bring relief and deliverance. It's not dependent upon you to do it. But if you don't do it, you'll miss out on the chance to participate. That's very clearly what we believe. This is one of the main kind of back and forth arguments between what we would say is Reformed theology and Arminian theology. And I don't want you to get too involved in that, but it's a fun discussion someday for you and your friends to hang out. And there's much more a sense, Reformed theology is much more a sense of God is at work and God will not be thwarted. An Arminian has a much more effective argument. The Arminian argument is God needs you. And if you don't do it, it's not going to happen. You need to step up because God has called you and it depends upon you. Pretty effective argument. You know, for those of us in the Reformed theology, it's like God's going to do it. It's going to happen. If you want to show up, you'll get a chance to participate. If you don't show up, it's going to happen anyway. God's going to bring relief and deliverance. What you're going to miss out on is the chance to participate and being a part of that. And then he goes on. Who knows? Who knows? Perhaps you, Esther, have come to royal dignity for such a time as this. I just love that just statement. For such a time as this. I hope that becomes part of your daily discourse. Because I think sometimes we have to ask, maybe I am this person's mom for such a time as this. Maybe I am in this office for such a time as this. Maybe I'm in this neighborhood for such a time as this. Maybe the role I have, the place I play, maybe God has put me here where I am for such a time as this. It's a wonderful thing.
I remember being hit with that statement with Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it just hit me right like that because there was a statement that he made. Maybe this is why I'm here.
Maybe why I'm here. For such a time as this. Maybe, and I think there's, and you've got to appreciate what Esther does is she says, get the community praying. Pray for me. She looks for communal discernment, but she is also she is willing to say, maybe it's time for this, for such a time as this. She asks for prayer, and then she says, after that, I will go to the king, though It is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Esther's a hero. She's a woman of courage. She is willing to put her life on the line for her people. She is willing to go against the law, but she goes against the law in this place. This is civil disobedience right now. This is people going on strike. This is people picketing. This is those things that we look at, and we have a country that says you're allowed to affect change by disobeying. There are consequences, but you're allowed to do that. That wasn't so true in Persia. And still, she's willing to do it. She's willing to put her life on the line and say, I'm willing to bear the consequences. I'm going to stand up. I'm going to try it. And if I die, I die. I will have died doing the right thing. This is a book of incredible courage. This is a book of someone willing to stand against the power. It's incredibly powerful. This is a book where most of us live. We live in messiness. We don't live in the clean temple world. We don't live in the more clean kind of churchish worlds. We live in the messiness. We live in the sense of, what, is this the right thing to do or not? Maybe I'm here for such a time as this. Maybe this is a time that I keep my mouth shut. What do I do? We live in the midst of difficult discernment about what does it mean to follow the Spirit? What does it mean to try to affect change? Which are the issues that are worth going for justice and which are the issues that are not? What does it mean to be people of justice? Where can I practice that? What does that look like? That's the type of place we live in. And I think that might be the reason that the Qumran community was like, we don't know what to do with this book. We don't know how to handle this book. This is not a book about religious people going to the temple. This is a book about people far from the temple. This is about people practicing things that are far from the temple. This is a group about people doing things that are far from temple worship and temple activity and temple behavior. And yet these are people living in the world, affecting change, and trying to be people of justice, trying to be people who are writing out the systemic injustice that's going on. Why is this book important? This book is incredibly important. Why are the actions of Esther incredibly important? Had she not written this out of the legal code, then Ezra and Nehemiah would never have been given permission to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the wall. It all rests upon this. Had it been written into the legal code, there would not have been the permission. There would not have been the freedom given to go back to Jerusalem, to rebuild the wall, to rebuild the temple, to bring Jerusalem back. It was because this decree was written out of the legal code that then the freedom was given. And we'll find some of these characters still make their way into Ezra and make their way into Nehemiah, where this freedom is then given years later to be able to go back and rebuild Jerusalem. But it was the work of Esther, the messy work of Esther. It's a great story, isn't it? I want you guys to talk in your group if you get a chance. You can just talk about the story because it's a wonderful one. But how can you better practice celebration? You know what? If we just wait for celebration to happen, it won't happen. Celebration requires people who look ahead, people who plan ahead, people who work on the themes, people who say, we're going to mark this. How can you better celebrate? How can you better practice celebration in your church family? How can you better practice celebration in your own family, in your neighborhood community? What does it mean? Because part of celebration is this community. Part of celebration is bringing community together. One of the things we love doing in our neighborhood is having a Christmas party. And we've done it enough, and we just started doing it, and our neighborhood was like, we don't know what to do with this. And now they're like, when's the Christmas party? We want to know. It's become an important part of the tradition, and college students come home to make sure they can make it for the Christmas party because it's an important time for the neighborhood just to gather together. What can you do to be someone who is intentionally planning and practice celebration and joy? Where are you right now for such a time as this? Because everyone's somewhere. Where are you for such a time as this? Where are the places that you can be a person who affects change in the areas where God has put you? Where has God put you right now? Where do you need courage? Where do you need courage? Think about the courage that it took for Esther to go and break the law and stand in front of the king. Where do you need courage? And Where are the places of systemic injustice that you can affect change? There are places all around us. Where are possibly the places of systemic injustice? I'm a huge fan of the International Justice Mission. And what Gary Haugen basically says is it's like, I encourage you to find the places of justice, of injustice, that require the minimum amount of work to change. He's like, basically look for the low-hanging fruit. Don't go and try to change the major places of injustice. Don't go and try to write out systemic injustice in the Constitution. Start with the small places. Where can you affect change? Where can you affect change? Where are the places of injustice that you can change with the most smallest of effort? But where are the places of injustice that are around? We are people that are called to be people of justice. If we remember Jesus, when he talked to the Pharisees, he said, you're doing well on the religious stuff. You're tithing your mint, you're tithing your dill. You're doing really well on the religious stuff. Good for you. You just forgot two of the most important things in following me: justice and mercy. Where are possibly places of justice? It might be in the school system if you're there. It might be in the neighborhood. It might be in the community. It might be in local politics. Where could you be someone who works for justice? And possibly where could you be involved in the messiness of getting that injustice written out of the legal code so that justice will reign? Remember, our courts are courts of law. It's our job to make them courts of justice, because the law in our country is written by the people. It's our job. The kings in our culture are us. We don't have anyone to blame except for us. We're the ones who make the call. We're the ones who elect the people into leadership. We're the ones who can ask and request and call them to be people of justice. So where are we people who affect justice? Where we're called? Let me pray for us. Lord, thank you for these. Thank you for these stories. Thank you for these books. Thank you for the ones that are especially the hardest to wrap our arms around. The ones about beauty and sex and spas and celebration and excessive drinking. What do we do with these, Lord? Give us wisdom that we might be people that are of your heart, that we might be people of your justice, that we might be people who are working toward your kingdom in all that we do. May we be participating, Lord, in what you are calling us to do. In your name we pray. And all God's people said, Amen.